Hey guys, let's talk about Frybo. First of all, I want to apologize if my voice is a little crackly today or a little deeper than usual. I do have a terrible cold. I also apologize if there's a lot more cuts in this video than usual. That means that I had to stop to cough and or sneeze. What are you going to do? Also, spoiler warning, not just for this episode, but for future episodes of the show, potentially, depending on what I end up talking about. And with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get talking about this episode. This is, again, Frybo, the 5th episode of Steven Universe, chronologically speaking, and it's not one of my favorites. It's not an episode I have a lot of negative feelings about, though, either. It's just kind of a so-so episode, and it does introduce some interesting things, which I'm going to talk about here. As with Together Breakfast, the plot of this episode is deceptively simple. Steven is looking for his jeans, and he bumps into Pearl, who is looking for a gem shard, and this is an interesting thing I am going to talk about later, but for now we're going to skip it. She gives him a big talk about what the gem shards are and what they can do, but since Steven isn't interested in that, he zones out, and we get his inner dialogue as he is thinking about other things, and it's absolutely hilarious and a really good storytelling technique because Steven is our viewpoint character, and this way we are surprised by the things that he has to learn because he didn't listen to Pearl, and that lesson itself is pretty simple. We'll talk about that later too. So anyway, Pearl goes off to continue to search for her missing shard, and Steven finds his jeans. They are walking around, and the cool thing about the scene where Steven is zoned out from what Pearl is saying is we can still kind of hear it in the background, so we already know what's going on. We already know that these are shards used to animate armor during combat, but they aren't used anymore because the longer they remain in contact with armor, the more disobedient they become, but Steven obviously didn't hear this. So he finds his pants, he finds a gem shard in his pants, and he goes out into the town to look for Pearl, to show it to her, and he bumps into his friend Peedee, who is one of the kids of the guy who runs the fry shop, and he is working as the mascot, Frybo, which is a terrifying demon. And, I mean, wow, I'm glad we never see this thing again. It's freaky. Even before it gets possessed by a gem shard, because, of course, Peedee hates being the mascot, and Steven being Steven, he puts the gem shard in the costume and it comes to life. Now granted, Steven does have the presence of mind not to use the gem shard first. He does try wearing the costume himself and gets attacked by birds. Actually, that's a recurring theme. Steven gets attacked by birds a lot in this show. I don't really know what to think about that, honestly. And I do want to point out a slight similarity between this episode and an episode Beach City Horror Club, which I'm dreading talking about later on in the run of this series. But I'll get through it. In that episode, a blue gemstone possesses the lighthouse above the gem temple and effectively brings it to life. That's very similar to what these gem shards do. And I do find that an interesting bit of continuity, considering we know nothing else about these gem shards. It's heavily implied that they have some kind of consciousness in them, which means they were probably a living gem at some point. That they were probably all part of the same gem. And even when we see Pearl putting them in her bubble, it looks like they are forming some kind of spherical crystal. Anyway, Frybo comes to life and he rampages around the town, forcing people to eat french fries because he doesn't understand exactly what his duty is supposed to be, and they have to try to stop him, but they aren't powerful enough. Luckily, Pearl shows up. She pierces him with her spear, which is a disgusting scene because he starts bleeding ketchup out of his eye. It's absolutely gross, but it weakens him enough and distracts him long enough for Steven to use the other gem shards to animate the rest of his outfit. Thankfully, he was wearing layers today or he wouldn't have had enough soldiers, and because they're relatively fresh, they listen to his commands and they take down Frybo. And it ends with naked Steven, the Frymans, and Pearl. Sorry, that image popped back in my head, made me laugh. Giving the Frybo costume a proper Viking burial at sea. Just this show, man, it does the weirdest stuff. Like I said, though, this show isn't bad. It isn't great either. It's middle of the road for Steven Universe. It's about an average Steven Universe episode, which is another stark contrast going back from this most recent run of episodes, which has been exceedingly good, like really freaking good, to an episode that's only middle of the road. It was kind of jarring, though I don't dislike this episode. However, this episode did introduce something about the show that I don't particularly like. It was the first time that we were introduced to this concept that the show will develop other characters other than the main characters without that development really affecting the main characters much at all. Yes, Steven learns a lesson in this episode, which is when someone tells you something is important, you should listen to them. Also, that you should always listen to Pearl, but that's just my personal life lesson. But everything going on with Peedee was entirely separate from that, and it's cool that he got some genuine character development, having to come to terms with his role in the family business. But that development itself had nothing to do with Steven or the gems, and sometimes you'll get an episode where it develops one of these secondary characters that's good, but sometimes we don't, and those episodes really, really annoy me. Overall, Frybo was a generally fun time, a little creepy, but for the most part, a good episode of this show that I really have no problems with. But guys, what did you think of this episode? Let me know in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.